Hi, you've tuned in to Radio Northern Beaches, your Listen Local station, right here on the Northern Beaches of Sydney. You can find us on your radio dial at 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Can't get to a radio? No worries. You can always stream our program live from anywhere in the world at rnb.org.au. And for listening on your own schedule, our podcasts are available globally at rnbpodcast.com.au. So be sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Now, here is our latest podcast.
Welcome again, listeners, to Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, streaming live. It's our website, www.rnb.org.au. Programs, Community Voices. I'm Michael Lester, and we're delighted to welcome back yet again the local independent federal member for Warringah, Zali Steggall. Thanks very much for taking the time again, Zali, to join us here on Radio Northern Beaches.
My pleasure.
Zali, some good economic news today with the RBA making its third cut to interest rate for the year and bringing the rate down to about 3.6%. I think more broadly, this suggests an economy where, as we know, the government's priority now, having in this first term concentrated, as it said, economically on trying to bring down inflation, which now seems to be reasonably under control. They've clearly set their sights on productivity and economic growth to grow the economy. We've had very sluggish productivity performance and growth performance, and they've got this big productivity roundtable, economy roundtable coming up. Meanwhile, I think you've recently just issued a pretty broad-ranging and ambitious statement of your own. I think you call it a Re-energized Economy white paper, and presumably as input to this economic reform roundtable. What prompted you to put such a comprehensive proposal together at this time?
Well, look, we've had a number of town halls and discussions with the community. I also meet a lot with particular interest groups and industries and, areas from chambers of commerce, small business representative, the council of small business, to particular industries that are looking at they have the opportunity to be part of our transition and really re-energize the economy and boost that productivity, but we need certain settings to be right. And at the moment, I would say the government is still very wedded to old policies and old industries. And whilst we're spending a lot on the transition towards net zero and trying to decarbonise our energy sector, we're still spending a lot of public money on old vested sort of old policies. So we're not doing it in as cost-effective way as possible. So this white paper, I teamed up with an economist, Emma Esbert. She's an economist out of ANU, to really look at holistically what are the areas where we can boost productivity whilst also taking care of our climate resilience and that transition to net zero, and really broadening the benefits. So I'm a bit critical. The government tends to only focus on very big business opportunities, like, $2 billion on hydrogen policy, for example, not so much on assisting SMEs to benefit from innovation and for smaller to medium-sized businesses to really boost that productivity. So this white paper is focusing on that. What are the barriers? What are the roadblocks that are still getting in the way of SMEs being able to innovate, boost productivity, and they are the ones who create the jobs for the future?
I think, in your own words, with the document, I think you're calling in this document for a bold transformational approach and reforms. You say you want to challenge economic thinking and unshackle Australia. These are strong pieces of rhetoric. But before we discuss some of the elements of this, I'm wondering about the politics, though. We've got a second-term, huge majority Labor government. They don't need anyone else's help, do they, in getting their own economic agenda up? What's the reality of putting up a bold transformational program like yours, and what chance of impact is there?
Well, look, the reality is there's a vacuum of ambition from both the government and the coalition. Well, look, the coalition, I would argue, are a house of cards at the moment, and they are absolutely missing in action when it comes to sensible policies, accepting transition to net zero and where those economic opportunities are going to be for the Australian economy. So in the absence of that pressure from the opposition, you have a government that is being fairly meek, I would say, mild in its ambition. And we are still we're funding the transition in a very clunky way. It's the best way I could say, in that you've got the cost of transition from the energy sector, for example, trying to boost and underpin new industries. You know, how do we incentivise and get to green steel, green cement, and really decarbonise and create those opportunities onshore, domestically? But we can't keep having the handouts to old industries. So, for example, when we look at the amount of diesel fuel tax credit that goes to the fossil fuel industry, so to transport and mining alone, there's $10 billion over 3 years. So we're talking huge amounts of public money that are still going to old legacy industries. That absolutely needs to be phased out. We can't keep doing it that way. The Treasurer talks about wanting to get some fiscal repair into the budget and for it to be more sustainable, and looking at sort of where do we change our revenue base. We have to look at areas like phasing out diesel fuel subsidies, but also getting proper revenue from areas like the PRRT, so the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax. So that is the revenue Australia gets from its gas resources, that we essentially get a lot of foreign multinationals get the licence and the rights to extract it. They sell it offshore and they contribute very little. So we have to move away from our tax system that overly burdens the individual and doesn't look at those really big profits as the big multinationals and those big industries that are making super profits, I think, at the expense of everyday Australians.
Yeah, the climate and transition issues loom large in your economic transformation plan. Where do we stand at the moment from your point of view in that respect as a country? For example, and in particular, we're supposed to be, the government's supposed to be setting later in the year, which seems a long time away, again, the 2035 emission reduction targets on the basis of advice from the Climate Change Authority. What is the politics of that? And what do you think are the sort of targets that we need to try and have to hit?
Well, again, there's no excuse for the government not to be ambitious. So we have, I think the 2025 election was a resounding election in rejecting the coalition's plan and nuclear, and it was a vote of confidence for the transition to net zero and renewable energy. Now, we need to do that in as cost effectively and as timely a way as possible. And for that, it does require looking at where are our opportunities, how can we underpin that transition. But it has to go beyond the energy sector. It has to go to innovation and manufacturing and incentivising more investment into research and development and lifting productivity. So at the moment, we just don't have the levers in place from the government to really assist SMEs to be in this space and to be competitive. So I have proposed, for example, that we should have a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which, for example, the cement industry strongly support because they are getting priced out by cheaper imports that have a higher carbon footprint. So a carbon border adjustment mechanism will create a fairer trading marketplace domestically where our big emitters already have to deal with their emissions through the safeguard mechanism. I'm also proposing a climate resilience levy on our fossil fuel exports because rather than have them contribute through taxes to foreign nations that import their product, it would be better for us to recoup that revenue domestically through an export levy so that we can pay for the resilience in Australia. Of course, as you say, under the Paris Agreement, Australia is due to lodge its next nationally determined contribution in September, so it's only a few weeks away. And if the government fails to be ambitious, then it is basically saying it is walking away from the Paris Agreement's goal, which is keeping temperatures in check by being as ambitious as possible. What's interesting is there are key sectors of business and industry who are calling on the government to set an ambitious target. And let's be frank, it needs to be a minimum of 75% emissions reduction by 2035 to send a clear signal to international investors that Australia is a jurisdiction taking this opportunity seriously and come and invest in Australia, because we have a policy outlook that is ambitious and that will welcome that kind of investment.
Meanwhile, you've put forward what you've called a climate resilience plan, which seems to be premised on a notion that we're already, regardless of whatever targets and emissions, encountering substantial real risks and damage costs that are costing us billions around the country and are going to cost more because we're not perhaps mitigating at the rate we need to. And one might think that these damage costs are going to grow faster and faster. What's the key thinking behind a climate resilience plan? I believe you're proposing a $10 billion resilience fund to fund resilience infrastructure, particularly for local government.
Absolutely. So what we've had for quite a long time now is government of the day responds to disasters with fairly costly disaster emergency payments to communities, which are vital for those communities to get back on their feet. But we fail to ever invest in prevention. And unfortunately, we know that we've already passed certain thresholds when it comes to warming, and there's a certain amount that's baked in. Now, that doesn't mean we don't need to be ambitious and mitigate, and every 0.1 of a degree will make a huge difference. So on one hand, we have to be ambitious about mitigating the problem, but we also have to be, and the government needs to be honest with the Australian people about addressing the scale of the risk and the problem and the exposure and where our communities are at risk and what can be done to help, alleviate the consequences. So we've seen just this year, ex-cyclone Alfred, which was for about a week, the scale of damage is in the order of about $13 billion to the economy. And that's one event for 1 week. Meanwhile, as a continent, we have areas that are in flood, areas that are in drought, we have bushfires, and then you have events like ex-cyclone Alfred. So economically, we can't afford to not invest. And the data actually is really compelling. It basically says for every $1 we invest now in resilience building, in adaptation and prevention, you save $11 on disaster recovery and relief and emergency payments down the road. Now, politically, that's more difficult because the government of today doesn't care so much about saving money for the government of tomorrow, right? So they want that immediate kind of benefit. But the reality is Australian people benefit from investing now. And the way you see it all the more is through your insurance premiums. At the moment, we have a risk profile that just keeps getting worse and worse. And insurance companies calculate their risk profile on a yearly basis. And so premiums will keep on getting more and more unaffordable. We already know about 1 in 5 households are underinsured or uninsured. So when disaster strikes, and unfortunately we know that disaster is likely to strike more and more frequently and in more and more areas, more and more people are at risk of losing everything they've worked for in their life. So it's really important that the government starts to invest. I see this as like our domestic defence, right? We spend a huge amount on defence to defend ourselves from foreign nations and enemies. We need to start defending ourselves from climate impacts, and that requires investment. So local governments, everyone would have seen our roads are getting worse and worse. Flooding occurs when stormwater drainage doesn't cope. Every LGA will be different in what it needs. It will have a different risk profile. But our local councils do not have the money to pay for the infrastructure and adaptation that they need to do to help their communities. So at first instance, it's money to go to local government and then also to individual householders to assist with lowering risk. And that means then you can have more affordable insurance and I think then better lending terms from banks.
Guest here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches, Zali Steggall, our local independent federal member for Warringah. We're talking particularly about the economic and productivity and growth challenges facing Australia in the period ahead, but particularly the opportunities for a transition away from fossil fuels to more sustainable forms of development and newer industries and clean industries and smart industries around that. As you've said, I think nearly 90% of the federal already growing and large disaster assistance funding, nearly 90% of it's just going to cleaning up the mess after it happens, and only less than about 10% to reducing future risks. This $10 billion fund you're suggesting, the climate and resilient, so how's that going to be financed?
We've had that costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office that we can divert $10 billion of public funding from currently paid to transport and mining companies around the diesel fuel tax credit. If that was phased out over 3 years, that would divert $10 billion of public funds towards resilience, which we know that pays a dividend to our communities. And it would actually result in a $1.5 billion positive outcome on the budget, because currently the diesel fuel tax credit actually pays a cream on top, if I could describe it like that, to transport and mining sectors. So if those sectors simply paid for their fuel and obviously deducted from any income the tax paid for that fuel and the cost of that fuel, so it's still a budget neutral from their expense point of view, it would be $1.5 billion better off to the Australian budget, because they actually there are many ways in which we can do much better revenue raising to pay for resilience, but that is a very simple one that I've proposed. I'm also calling for $30 million into the Resilient Building Scheme, which is a scheme that can be expanded. It's currently in effect, and it helps householders understand how they can invest in the resilience of their property, where the kind of roofs they use, insulation, flood-proofing it, lots of different measures. And there are insurers that are on board, I think Suncorp and a couple of others are. They recognise what we could describe as a resilient building certificate, and then that lowers the risk profile for that property, and then lower insurance premiums can be available. Hosted a roundtable already where banking and insurers are at the table with local government, because it's in everyone's interest that we solve this puzzle. At the moment, individual Australians are left basically at high risk of losing everything they've worked for when a disaster strikes.
Now, Zali, a key element of your white paper called a Re-energised Economy is a transition from fossil fuels to new industry structures, more sustainable, more clean, as well as future-based smart industries. A key element is to promote innovation and research and development, particularly in small and medium-sized enterprises. Why have you got a particular focus with your innovation and R&D on small and medium enterprises?
Well, because all too often they are the ones that miss out. It's actually where we have the smarts and where we have really entrepreneurial people in Australia, but government tends to be lobbied and have listen to big business, big industry, big business, and you will frequently see the government announcing big amounts of money, like a couple of $1 billion here and to, Gina Rinehart for lithium or for battery production or copper or a hydrogen plant policy. You don't hear of similar levels of investment and support for small to medium businesses, because it's much harder for them to get in and access the programs that are set up and the grants. So we are really calling on the government to focus on that, because in fact the vast majority of Australia's productivity and innovation comes from SMEs, and yet they are really overburdened with compliance costs and just the red tape for them to get through or access any government programs is really difficult. But of course, my paper also looks at around AI. I'm calling for a special envoy for AI and the future of work, because we know AI will really help productivity for certain businesses, especially small businesses. but it also needs guardrails to ensure it is safe. Government traditionally is too slow at responding to those risks. Also, my paper looks at housing, right? We can't hope to have a lift in productivity and a generation of innovators for the future if they can't find housing, right? We know the data shows that once people have security of housing, they can invest in their education and training, and they invest in business opportunities. So everything is interlinked. You can't talk of one thing without.
To fund these measures that you're proposing in your white paper for this transition, you're proposing, among other things, the introduction of a fossil fuel export levy, I believe, which would be on our biggest export earning industries, presumably coal and gas. You're also proposing reforms to the existing petroleum resources rent tax. What sort of dollars are you looking at here, and is this a realistic political proposition?
Well, we have to have this conversation because it's really to create a fair playing field, a fair market. Currently, the big emitters domestically are caught under the safeguard mechanism, but those that are just looking at exporting are completely let off the hook, yet they are contributing to the problem. And in fact, they may well pay a levy or the equivalent of a safeguard mechanism in a foreign nation. So then the other nation benefits from that payment. We don't. So if we have a really holistic approach of trading in Australia, where we have our domestic emitters are caught under the safeguard mechanism, imported products are caught by a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and exported products are caught by a climate resilience levy, then we are capturing at all angles of, I guess, the trade, the revenue benefit for Australia, rather than other nations collecting the revenue.
A second major strand of your white paper, called Re-energized Economy, is focused on trying to tackle intergenerational equity, or the lack of it these days. And you've got a number of prongs there, including around housing, where you're proposing we need to make modifications to the capital gains tax and also to raise taxes on foreign investors. Are these two key important elements of how you think intergenerational equity can be advanced?
Well, we know there are many aspects to intergenerational inequity. We have to have broad tax reform, but housing is a major issue, and housing affordability is a major issue. And at the moment, the government is very focused on the supply side of the question. So a big focus on a lot of spending and a lot of construction and building, fast tracking more building. But I don't think it's realistic to address the housing crisis by just looking at the supply side of the equation. We have to look at the better utilisation of current stock, and we have to look at the demand side pressures on price, which is overwhelmingly the capital gains exemptions for investors. Now, it is not about changing anything to do with the family home or changing the exemption for first investment properties. But what we've had modelled is what would be the impact of having a decreasing scale of benefit. So the second investment property would simply benefit from a 25% deduction to capital gains and none from the third onwards. So it's I would say a modest change, but it's a signal change to the demand measures when it comes to housing and trying to bring it back into being more affordable.
You're also proposing some adjustments to negative gearing in this context, aren't you?
The data and the briefings I've had show that negative gearing is not as big a player. So the biggest impact on investment and the demand side pressure is actually the capital gains exemptions for investment property. So I'm open to the conversation, but on the data that I've been provided, the negative gearing is not as big an issue, that it is not as broadly utilised and does not cost the budget nearly as much as what the capital gains exemptions do.
Well, thanks, Zali Steggall, for taking us through these big picture issues that you've picked up in advance of the government's forthcoming economic reform and productivity timetable, and your white paper on a re-energised economy, as well as your ideas and proposals for building a more positive approach towards climate resilience. And just before we close, Zali, I wanted just a broader comment on recent developments. The announcement only yesterday that the Prime Minister made that Australia is going to recognise Palestine at the UN in September. And before that, of course, among other things, we've had a lot of protest activity, including the protest on the Harbour Bridge with various reactions to it. I'm wondering, what's your own take from a community point of view on what's going on with our position on Palestine and Gaza and Israel?
The whole conflict has been just incredibly distressing to many, many people in the community, and me including. First and foremost, we know there are still hostages held, and so that is a real problem around obviously wanting to see a resolution of this issue. But the humanitarian crisis around the withholding of aid, food and water is just unconscionable, and it's clear much greater pressure needs to be brought on Israel to comply with international human rights law. So I've had a number of briefings and meetings, met with MSF and other organisations, really understanding the scale of the crisis. I should say I joined the march on the Harbour Bridge. It was very much a march for humanity, and it was very much families coming together, a lot of children who were, I think, the plight of children, the Palestinian children, is really just a huge concern. We get a huge amount of correspondence on that. I mean, there's something like 18,000 children have been killed to date in the conflict, and there are many more dying each day of starvation now. So there has to be greater pressure brought to bear on the Netanyahu government to distinguish between its fight with Hamas, pursuing, obviously, strongly the pursuit of the release of the hostages, but the calls by the Netanyahu government to expand and take over 100% of Gaza is horrifying when it comes to the humanitarian crisis. Look, I welcome the announcement by the government around recognising the state of Palestine at the next UN convention, obviously with conditions. Hamas is a terrorist organisation, cannot be part of it. It must be with the Palestinian Authority, and there must be coexistence of the state of Israel and a state for Palestinians. The whole situation is incredibly dire. The humanitarian crisis for innocent civilians is incredibly dire.
There is the political reaction to some of what's going on here in Australia along the lines of we don't want to import those conflicts from overseas into our own society, and some strong views that we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. In particular, we've seen the report from the Special Envoy on anti-Semitism reactions with the proposals. Do you think that is a positive way for us to go to manage the community concerns and debate about these issues?
I absolutely support that we cannot be importing foreign conflicts. We have war zones and atrocities occurring all over the world. So we cannot import that into Australian society, and our social cohesion is incredibly important. And over the last 2 years, that has been a focus for me of managing that, but also making sure that we don't see, and fighting against any rise of anti-Semitism. So I've supported much of that. I do have some concerns around the Special Envoy's report, though, I should say, in relation to the definition used, but also, I guess, that call for what could be viewed as powers over the media and our public broadcaster in circumstances where we have an overarching anti-racism framework in Australia. And so I've been calling for 2 years, actually, for the government to implement the full anti-racism framework. And there were 63 recommendations, and they have sort of been pushed aside in preference for the anti-Semitism Special Envoy and the Islamophobia. And my concern is, I think we need to look at it more holistically from an anti-racism framework point of view. We need to ensure we have strong anti-discrimination and laws to call out all kinds of hatred. I have had many engagements within our local community, with our Jewish Australian community and very much where there's been instances and increases of fears of anti-Semitism, of making sure that the right response from the government is there. But again, we can't pick and choose when we want international human rights law to apply. And we want it to apply when it comes to our interests, when we're in the Pacific, or if we look at Taiwan, for example. I have serious issues with continuing to be a major trading partner with a nation like Israel that is in complete disregard of international human rights law when it comes to the impact of a conflict on civilian populations. And I should say the targeting of media. This conflict has seen a unprecedented record number of media killed in direct targeted attacks, and that is unconscionable.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed, Zali Steggall, independent member, our local member indeed for the Northern Beaches, the seat of Warringah. Thanks once again for taking the time for discussing these important issues with us. All the best. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. We've got the world's best beer. But most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3. Now hitting the entire world on www.rnb.org.au.